The Wood Elves are best known for their ranged roster, with a large number of units that will carry you from the early game all the way to the end. Sadly, their front lines tend to suffer, as a lot of them lack any real defense, making the later game a lot of turns waiting for replenishment if you can't keep everyone healthy. They also have a decent selection of monsters and tree spirits to bring some much needed support to the front lines, especially as the game goes on. Micromanagement is a real skill that you need to master when playing as them, as the squishier roster on the whole means you need to move a lot faster to take enemies out before you take too much damage. They're also one of the most mobile factions with high speed across the board, and most of their ranged troops being able to pretty easily skirmish when they need to. And finally, they also lack a large flying roster, so can be outmaneuvered from the sky fairly easily, especially early on. It is a little bit niche, but as Elves of the Wood, you'd expect them to be a little more airborne than just 2 units. Now let's get into the roster. First up we have the Lords, and first we have Orion. He is a great all-round fighter. He has high damage from a range as well as in melee, with high attack and defense stats and even charge bonus and a decent speed. He's a little let down by the very low armor, but has the defense and some physical resistance to keep him alive a little bit more. Uses ammo up first, focusing on single entities to make the most of his high damage missiles before sending him into melee. Once he is in melee, avoid high damage enemies even if they aren't overly armor piercing, since anything that gets through his defense is going to hurt quite a bit. Keep him supported with other units so he doesn't get surrounded, and he should do great keeping allied units encouraged and dealing great damage himself. And if it really comes down to it, he will fight to the end with the unbreakable leadership, so take down a lot of enemies even if he goes with them. Next up we have Durthu. Durthu is a great frontlines caster. The Lore of Beasts is a pretty decent lore with damage and utility, so he can support his army whilst also dealing plenty of damage of his own. Place him in the middle of your front line so he can get cast wherever needed, then let him go to town. He has great armor piercing magical damage, so nothing can ignore his swings. He actually has really great melee stats for a giant unit and a ton of armor as well as missile and physical resistance for some added tankiness, making him actually pretty tough to take out. Of course he's a massive target, so missiles in large enough quantities can take him out, so avoid letting him get focused if at all possible. Other than that, just keep him battling against basically anything and he'll put in work. As long as he doesn't get surrounded, he should do great. Next we have the Sisters of Twilight. They're a missile focused lord with a choice of 2 missiles, and you should definitely be swapping between these depending on what you're shooting at. Use the flight to get a good firing position and focus fire on the highest priority targets you can to make the job of your front lines easier. If they manage to run out of ammo, they can do fine in melee against weaker targets like back lines, but they are not front lines worthy with their mediocre weapon strength and lack of armor piercing. Add on their hitbox and low defense and armor, and they go down fast versus high damage. Keep them out of high damage melee and watch out for them being focused from a ranged, as they still make an easy target when sat completely still. They start on the Eagle, but can eventually unlock Seth in Ha. This increases most stats aside from speed and attack. They gain massive armor piercing, magical and poison damage, making them able to assist front lines with ease. They also gain the soporific breath ability for some added damage, best used on single entities in a crowd for maximum effect. Just be cautious of the increased hitbox and reduced speed, as they can still get focused down either in melee or from a range and go down possibly even faster from the high rate of damage coming in. Now, final legendary lord is Draika. She is a decent early game multitasker. She has the great Lore of Shadows, which will be her main use going into the late game with all the damage and utility it brings. Aside from this, she's alright in melee as long as it's not versus high armor. Her damage is good but not overly armor piercing, so will struggle versus tougher enemies. She's decently tough herself with high armor and decent melee stats, so as long as she's not against super high armor piercing damage, she should do just fine. As she does take more damage, she'll make herself and nearby allied units more deadly, increasing attack and base weapon damage, so make sure she's placed in the middle of your damage dealing front lines to make the most of her effects. First of our generic lords is the male Glade Lord. These are decent hybrid weapons lords with passable stats for melee and ranged without being super strong at either. They lack armor piercing in either, so against tougher enemies they're going to struggle to punch through. Focus their attention on less armored targets first from a range before moving them into melee. They're good at both, but missiles are safe to use, so try to run out of ammo before you throw them into the thick of combat. They're not the toughest with good defense but low armor, so once in melee keep them against low tier troops, both toughness and damage wise, to keep them safe and dealing damage. They also have 4 mounts. The Elven Steed gives them a massive amount of speed and some charge bonus. They still want to be used the same to focus on ranged even more with that new speed, allowing them to be great skirmishers. It also comes with a large hitbox, so avoid range and being surrounded in melee is also a worry you have to consider. We also have the Great Stag. This loses a little speed to gain some armor, weapon strength and more charge bonus. As well as this, they gain a large portion of armor piercing melee damage, so can now take on much tougher targets and still deal great damage, at least in melee. They can still use their missiles whilst charging in and out of enemies to make the most of the new melee and charge damage. Just avoid letting them get focused, as again, the size has gone up, making them easier to focus fire or pin down in melee. They have the Great Eagle, which gains a ton of speed and flight, as well as weapon strength and charge bonus at the cost of a defense, armor, and that armor piercing. If you want to focus solely on range, then this is a great mount for them to get them firing from wherever you need them. If you need them for anything else like melee or charging, then stick with the Stag. And finally we have the Forest Dragon. This drops some speed, attack and charge bonus to gain back the armor piercing and then some, as well as a ton more HP, poison and magical attacks. It's basically just a non-named Seth in Ha, so use it just like that and you'll do great. The Glade Lords also have a female variant. The only difference between the male and female is the abilities they can get, with males focusing on melee and females focusing on range, so just go with whichever you prefer. They are literally the exact same aside from this, with the exact same 4 mounts. Next up we have Spellweavers, and these come with the Lore of Beasts, Lore of Dark Magic, Lore of High Magic, Lore of Life, or Lore of Shadows. Pretty much pure spellcasters that can assist armies with magical damage and buffs, debuffs, and that's about it. No real melee prowess to speak of unless it's zombies, so keep them in the back, casting, using your preferred lore to get your value. Damage is way too low to be worth it, and they'll just go down to a gentle breeze if it hits them in the right way. They also have 3 mounts. The Barded Athilmar Steed, which increases their speed, charge bonus, and HP. Still use them pretty much the same, just now use that increased speed to keep them out of danger and get the spells wherever needed. We have the Unicorn, which gives them a little bit more speed and charge bonus, as well as some attack. Still, use them the exact same, they still can't fight. And finally, the Great Eagle. Our final lord is the Ancient Treeman, and these come with the Lore of Life, but they can also use beasts and shadows in Draikus faction. Basically, they're like Durthu, but a little weaker in the attack and damage departments. Use them pretty much the same as him, you just won't be dealing as much damage in melee, so give them a little more support with whatever they're fighting. Now we come to the heroes, and first up we have Codil. He comes with a mix of the Lore of Beasts and Dark Magic. You'd think as a hero he'd be weaker than the Lords, but aside from defense, he's actually stronger than an Ancient Treeman. You can use him pretty much just like one getting on the front lines to deal massive damage to whatever he's up against, whilst also casting to provide even more support. He's also unbreakable, so if it all goes really wrong, he'll fight to the death before he runs away. Next we have Ariel. She has a mix of life, dark, and high magic. Once she has all her spells and abilities online, she's a real powerhouse. First of all, she's a great spellcaster, with a pretty varied spellbook for any occasion. She's not terrible in melee, but she's for sure not a fighter, with lower attack and not much weapon strength, at least not armor piercing. She'll do fine versus low armor and damage, but anything more than that is a little bit too much for her, so stick to casting for the most part. Our first generic heroes are the Waystalkers. These actually have the exact same missile stats as the Glade Lords, but just worse in melee. Use them like you would the Glade Lord, so aim to use up all of their missiles before even considering sending them into melee. They can fight on the move, so make for excellent sneaky skirmishers that can lead a force moving around the backs of enemy lines to get a better angle, or they can just sit on the backlines with their massive ranged and a curved firing arc. It really is up to you what you're fighting with and who you're up against. The Glade Captains are pretty much just smaller, less powerful Glade Lords with worse stats more or less across the board. Use them pretty much the same to shoot until they have no ammo or no choice but to get into melee. Focus on less armored troops and avoid high damage in melee, and they should do just fine. We also have 3 mounts: the Elven Steed, the Great Stag, and the Great Eagle. We also have the Spell Singers. These come in the Lore of Beasts, Life, and Shadows. Literally just the same as the Lords, but less HP and leadership. Use them the exact same, and you'll be fine. And they have 3 mounts: the Elven Steed, the Unicorn, and the Great Eagle. And our final heroes are the Branch Wraiths. These come with a mix of Lore of Life and Shadows, but they can also use the whole of the Lore of Life, Beasts, and Shadows in Draikus faction. These are like much weaker Draikers, but can still work in much the same way. Use their spells to support your army in whatever form is needed, and get them in some weaker melee if you absolutely need to. They don't deal a lot of damage, nor can they take a lot, so low defense and damage troops are what they want to focus on. Just prioritize the spells over everything else, as it really is where they get all their value. Now we come to the melee infantry. First up we have the Eternal Guard. These are your early game line holders with decent defense and toughness, especially for such an early unit. What's also surprising is their armor piercing damage, which is shockingly high for such an early cheap unit. Still, the focus should be on defense. Have them hold enemies still and bring in your missile troops to do all the real damage. With stats like these, most early enemies will be stuck fighting them plenty long enough for ranged troops to get a good angle and deal all the damage needed. Of course, against super high damage they'll still go down, but they are literally the first unit in the melee infantry, so we'll give them a break for that. They also come in another variant, Shielded Eternal Guard. Grabbing shields increases their defense by a nice chunk and drops charge bonus, so essentially no real downsides. Use them the exact same, only now they're a lot tougher versus all forms of damage. Next up we have Dryads. They have high armor, speed, attack, and no armor piercing damage, so are pretty decent chaff shredders and work great versus low armor and damage front lines. Sadly, low defense means against anything that throws damage back at them, they're going to struggle significantly and start to fall apart pretty quick. If you're going against a lot of chaff, then bring them along. Otherwise, I think you're much better off with some Shielded Eternal Guard. They just don't last long enough in combat to make them work in the standard Wood Elf playstyle. Next up we have War Dancers. These are a decent unit with a couple of caveats. They have good speed, attack, and damage with a bonus versus infantry, so can cut down most less armored targets with ease. Sadly, they have low armor, not much resistance, and not the highest defense, so against high damage, they feel just as much pain as they put out. They do have the Shadow's Coil ability, which allows them to trade a lot of their attack for some defense, which makes them a lot tougher, but kneecaps their damage output. This puts them in a weird spot where they can be super tough and need lots of support damage-wise, or deal great damage but need constant healing to keep them alive and fighting. Overall, they're probably a bit better if you're focusing on all-out damage rather than having a more solid front line. If you want a more traditional defensive front line, then I'd probably stick with Eternal Guard for now. But if you can handle the all-out offense, and believe me, that's where the playstyle is going, they're a decent pickup. We also have War Dancer Azerite Spears. These drop some attack, overall weapon strength, and charge bonus to gain defense, as well as armor piercing and a bonus versus large. This makes them a lot better as a general purpose unit rather than focusing completely on all-out attack. With a high defense, they can hold the line decently well in the mid-game even with their low armor. They also swap out Shadow's Coil for Woven Mist, which now trades melee defense for missile resist, making them weaker in melee but tougher versus ranged. This is great for using as they approach enemies to keep them high HP before the lines clash, and then they should switch back. There's still a trade-off from Eternal Guard if you ask me, since they won't be quite as tough even with the high defense, but you get a lot more damage and speed, so they can keep up with the rest of your army a lot easier. Next we have Wildwood Rangers. These are pretty much just improved War Dancers with stat improvements to most things that matter, but somehow even less defense, albeit just a tiny bit. They do get way more armor piercing and damage, as well as attack and armor, so they'll be dealing a ton more damage no matter what they're up against. They also shrug off most forms of non-armor piercing damage a lot easier, even if they are letting more hits through their defenses. They also gain some nice bonuses when fighting in Forest with the Guardians of the Wildwood ability, so anything you can do to proc that will get you a ton of value. Overall, they're another step towards the no defense, only attack playstyle, so you'll have to decide if it's worth it to you over the other options. Personally, I tend to skip these and go straight from Azerite Spears to the next unit. Blade Singers. These are pretty much the best parts of the last 3 units put into one, with the exception of any armor. Yeah, 15 is pretty horrific for the late game, but they do have pretty high defense, so it could be a lot worse. Plus, on the damage side of things, they really do have the best of almost every world. They have very high attack, magical, armor piercing, and anti-infantry damage. Plus, with their Willing Death ability, they can choose to trade armor piercing damage for more base weapon damage if they're up against low armor targets, so they're not wasting that armor piercing damage for no reason. Yes, they for sure fall into the no defense only attack category, but they have the highest defense in the set and their attack is pretty top tier, so whatever they're fighting won't have much time to deal damage to them, especially once you add on the fact that other units like missiles will also be attacking their target at the same time. They're not true line holders, but they will keep the enemy lines away from your ranged troops and give them some serious pain for their trouble whilst they do. Just make sure your micro is on point to keep enemies on their toes, otherwise sitting around waiting for missile spawns can quickly become an instant death. Now it comes to the ranged infantry. First up we have the Glade Guard. The missile damage is decent for the early game and the range is pretty great, especially considering they can fire on the move. I mean, what can I say? They're a great early game missile unit that can either sit on the backs of your front lines and fire over their heads for massive damage, or you can have them sneak around through the forest and fire into enemy backs from an unexpected location. The choice really is up to you on what you're dealing with on the map. Also, bear in mind that when they can fire on the move, that doesn't mean they can fire all around them like some other units, they can just fire in their frontal cone whilst moving. Whatever you do, keep them out of melee as the stats really aren't it. As long as they're firing and hitting enemy units, they'll be doing a great job. They also have a couple of variations. The Hagbane Tips Glade Guard are the exact same unit, only now with magical and poison missiles. Actually, they do get a little bit more armor piercing, but aside from that, they are the same units, use them the same, and deal more damage, cut through resistance, and debuff anything they hit. We also have Starfire Shaft Glade Guard. These swap the poison for flaming attacks and drop 4 overall missile strength. That being said, they gain a massive amount of armor piercing, so against high armor targets, they're going to hit a lot harder. Next up we have Deepwood Scouts. These actually have the exact same missile damage as the Glade Guard, with the only changes being more range, speed, and leadership, as well as Vanguard deployment and Stalk, make them into great skirmishing troops with a fully circular firing radius. That being said, you can use them more or less the same as the Glade Guard and same at the back of your lines to fire over units' heads, just as easily as you can move them around to fire into backs. Still avoid melee as much as possible, as they actually have worse stats than Glade Guard, so keeping them at range is a must, especially as you progress later into the game. They also have another variation, Swift Shiver Shards Deepwood Scouts. These drop a lot of range to increase their missile strength, but it's not what it seems. Yes, they gain magical damage and their strength is higher, but they're actually firing the same damage projectiles, only now they fire 2 at once. So yes, the damage is higher, but the range you sacrifice is pretty significant, so you have to decide if it's worth it for you, especially since it's a marginal increase in damage as far as armor piercing goes. The magical damage is nice, but armor is a lot more common than resistance, so you'll have to weigh up for what exactly you're up against. And finally, we have Way Watchers. Over the regular Deepwood Scouts, these gain improvements to nearly every stat, as well as a massive chunk of armor piercing. This makes them way better versus tougher armored targets, but other than that, you can use them pretty much the same as Deepwoods, either getting off a flank or stand on the back of your lines to rain fire onto whatever you come up against. Also, try to keep them away from enemies to activate their hawkish precision for even more damage in the armor piercing department. Finally, still avoid melee as much as possible. Their stats are terrible, and even if they weren't, the range damage pumps and is way safe to get off, so it's a no-brainer. Now we come to the cav units. First up we have the Spear Glade Riders. These are a pretty great mid-game shot cav unit. They have really high speed, so get into position and outrun unwanted battles with ease. They have a decent charge bonus, and not the best melee stats, so want to be used to charge into enemies before pulling out as soon as the charge ends. When you see their armor and less than amazing defense, you realize you need to be on top of your micro to ensure they stay alive. Leaving them in combat for too long will result in a quick death, so make sure to pull them out as soon as they're no longer charging before bringing them back in for more. Focus on backlines first, then move into the backs of the front lines to break enemies with ease. With speed like that, you can do pretty much whatever you want. Next up, we have Wild Riders. Honestly, you can use them pretty much the same, since they're just better in almost every way. The only thing that gets worse is the speed and defense, so you need to be a little bit more careful when positioning them to make sure they don't get caught out, and of course, manage them well once they're in combat to make sure they don't take too many hits. One cool thing about these guys, and pretty much all the Wood Elf units actually, is that they have Woodsmen, so unlike other large units in other factions, they suffer no penalties when moving through or fighting in forests, so feel free to make use of these for sneaky flanks or to make enemy large units a lot weaker. They also come in another variation, Shielded Wild Riders. They got 6 more defense and shields, still using the exact same, just now enjoy them being slightly tougher with no downsides. If you have the gold for them, they're a great pick. And finally, we have Great Stag Knights, yet another improvement to literally every single stat. They're faster, hit a lot harder, and are much tougher to get rid of. They even have the armor piercing damage, so not even the toughest foes on the enemy force can stand up to their charge. And yes, that's still what you want to be doing. Charging is the way to go to maximize damage and minimize casualties. Don't leave them in sustained combat no matter what, and they should put in work. Next up, we have the Missile Cavalry. First up, Glade Riders. Coming from the Spear Glade Riders, they lose a little HP, defense and charge bonus, but gain all of their missile strength, making them into a skirmishing unit. The range is pretty great, the speed is super high, and the damage is fine for early on par with the Deepwood Scouts actually. So if you want to put them on horses, then this is as close as you're going to get. Just keep them out of melee at all costs, as they won't do much damage and will go down pretty damn fast. Stick them on skirmish and pepper enemies as they make their approach before sending them around to find enemy backs for massive damage and less friendly fire. They also come in another variation, Hagbane Tipped Glade Riders. Similar to the Glade Guard, they gain magical and poison damage as well as slightly better armor piercing. You can still use them pretty much the same, but they'll do better with the higher damage output, cutting through resistance and debuffing anything they hit. Next up, Hawk Riders. They lose some HP, range, and a lot of models from the Glade Riders, but they do improve in almost every other stat and can of course fly. This means they can get into pretty much whatever firing position they want, as long as the enemy doesn't have any flyers, they're not really going to be contested. Now they are susceptible to ranged, being basically a giant floating target, so make sure they're taken out before posting them in a stationary firing position to keep them healthy. Other than that, getting behind the enemies and firing to their backs for risk-free damage. It's not insanely armor piercing, so less armored targets are ideal to get the most bang for your buck. The low entity count also means it's not the most devastating barrage, so it's more of a steady damage output, but as long as you can live with that, they're actually pretty good and get way better if used in the Sisters faction. Also, don't be tempted by the armor piercing melee. They have pretty terrible melee stats, especially defense, so it's not worth it against anything that can actually fight back. Some ranged infantry, maybe, but anything more than that, stick to the skies. And finally, the Sisters of the Thorn. These are a bit of a lateral move from the Hawk Riders, since you're giving up a lot of things to gain some very specific advantages. Of course, they can't fly, but they're slower, have less range, ammo, and damage in all forms. But they do gain poison missiles and 2 bound spells, which they can use regardless of Winds of Magic. This gives them some great support utility alongside just the raw damage output. Combine this with the poison, and it's pretty obvious that these are a pure support unit, meant to ease the job of other units in your army, rather than be a major damage dealer. It's not bad, but for a tier 3 unit it could be a lot better. Use them the same as Glade Riders and pop the spells at opportune moments to get the most value possible. Finally, we come to the monsters and beasts. First up, we have the Great Eagle. These are a decent early game monster with high weapon damage and charge bonus, but not the greatest melee stats. It's not terrible, but versus anything that can fight back, they'll take a lot of damage for their trouble. Use their high speed to flank back lines and take them out before they can get any value of their own. After all targets are gone, you can move on to the front lines, but focus on less damaging troops and always send them near to your other troops in your army to keep them safe. With the charge bonus and speed, you could either use them to cycle charge to get the absolute most out of them, but it's up to you if you can manage the micro. Next up, Treekin. These are a classic frontlines monster, but unlike others in this category, they have a much higher defense than attack. Remember in the melee infantry how none of them had a very large amount of defense? We're reversing the roles with these guys, hoping to be the tanks of the front lines with their massive defense and armor, and your front lines infantry wanting to focus on damage output, all while being supported by ranged and spells. It's a little weird to get used to, since you normally expect units like these to hit the lines with massive damage, then they're just tanky, but in the context of the roster, they're a great addition and work excellently for beefing up the front lines. Next up, we have the Tree Men. These are bringing the focus back to damage while still keeping some of that tankiness. They still have massive armor and defense for such a large unit, but now they have an almost equally huge attack stat alongside a nice helping of armor piercing magical damage. They're actually a tiny bit better than ancient Tree Men in combat, so you can use them pretty much the same to bring a ton of damage to the front lines, albeit with no spell support. Just send them in to fight pretty much anything, and as long as they don't get totally surrounded and isolated, they should be fine. Also, watch out for them being focused from a range, as they are pretty massive targets and will go down even with all their defenses. Next, Forest Dragons. This is pretty much just the Mount Dragons, but with no lords on top of it, making it a little bit worse across the board. That being said, you can still use it pretty much the same, so flying around, taking on pretty much anything. Use your breath ability for some added damage and land on basically anything that piques your fancy. Ranged troops are a good shout to keep itself and your army safe, but front lines can be just as good if they need the extra damage. Whatever you do, don't leave it to be focused from a range or surrounded in melee, and you should be fine. And finally, we have Zoes. These are going to do most of the same job as the Treekin, but with some slightly different stats. They're not as tanky with less defense and armor, but they gain more attack as well as a massive amount of armor-piercing damage alongside bonuses as large, magical, and dampen imbued attacks. They also come with a couple of support banned spells, so can give even more value alongside their respectable frontline stats. Use them just the same to beef up front lines, only this time with a little bit more damage than tankiness. Use their spells to keep your troops healthy and tough, and just keep them around other units to keep them healthy whilst avoiding being focused from range. We also have the Forest Spirit units that Dryker has access to as she explores the map. First up, Cave Bats. These are pretty similar to Fell Bats with better leadership, so use them just the same to blitz enemy backlines to take them out as fast as possible. Once backlines are all gone, do the same to the backs of the front lines. Using multiple units on one target works best for a big burst of damage and breaking units quickly, so bring a few of them to keep them useful. We have Giant Spiders. These work similar to Warhounds but have a lot more legs. Use their high speed to flank enemies and get into their ranged troops, and take them out with high poison and armor piercing damage. They're also relatively tough with high armor, so charging into the backs of the front lines isn't a bad idea as long as they are working with other units instead of being totally alone. Of course, sustained melee combat against something with high damage will end poorly for them with the low defense, so just make sure they're the ones surrounding enemies and not the ones being surrounded. We have Giant Wolves. These are like Warhounds, but only bigger. They still have great speed to get in flanks, and doing pretty much everything spiders do is the way to go. They're a lot faster and will be nearly impossible to pin down, and can chase down pretty much anything on land and do what Warhounds do best: wipe retreating units off the map and dismantle backlines in seconds. Use them for both these things for easy peasy value. Next up we have the Feral Manticore. Honestly, like half the factions in the game have one of these, so I've said it 100 times by now. High damage, but not much armor piercing. Send into the backlines with other units to support it, don't let them take too much damage or they'll rampage and likely die. We're done. Next up, Great Hawks. These are pretty much just the Cave Bats, but way better in nearly every single stat whilst losing some defense. Use them pretty much the same way, only now enjoy them doing a lot more damage. The drop in defense does mean going against actual damage is a lot more dangerous, so just pick your targets once you're finished with the backlines to keep them safe. And finally, Feral Bears. These are a little slower than the Wolves and have much less charge bonus, but get major improvements to pretty much everything else. This makes them great at the same job of flanking to take out backlines, you just have to be a little bit more careful with the lower speed. However, the Bones vs Large also makes them a great option for countering less armoured cavern monsters with their very high damage and attack stats. Just always be careful of going against high damage targets as they still have pretty poor armour, so will take a lot of hits. And of course, they're pretty chunky boys, so watch out for ranged. Do all this and they'll get some great value. Next up we have the Regiments of Renown. First up, the Wraiths of the Frozen Heart. They gain Frostbite attacks and Frenzy. The Winterheart Guards gain Unbreakable, Expert Charge Defense and Encourage. The Wardens of Synthrol gain a Silver Shield, Charge Defense versus Large, Vanguard Deployment Stalk and Charge Reflection, but lose a little bit of weapon strength and some charge bonus. Low-X Tricksters gain Attack, the Storm of Blades ability, the Low-X Shroud ability, and Frenzy. The Hawkeyes of Drakira gain Discouraged Imbued Missiles and the Smoke Bomb ability. The Wild Hunters of Kurnus gain Magical Attacks and Anti-Large bonus. The Lost Silver Knights lose HP, Defense, Weapon Strength, and all armor. They can now cause Terror, gain Strider, and 35% physical resistance. The Firebark Elders lose the Fire Weakness and gain Flame Attacks, the Wildfire Aura, and 40% fire resistance, and the Enigmas of Duran swap Earthblood for regrowth. Finally, we come to the army compositions. First up, tier 1, we're going to be leading our army with an Ancient Treeman. I mean, they really are the obvious choice. They're literally made of wood, they're great battlers, they have spells, and can carry an army right from the get-go. They'll be doing a ton of damage in the early game alongside spell support, so use them to lead from the front and just watch out for ranged focus. Even early game fire can add up to a lot of pain. For the front line, we're going to go with 9 Shielded Eternal Guard. These are the best front line we can get right now, onto the tier 1 units in the Wood Elves, a little bit limited. They're not the most damaging, but they can still hold most early units still long enough that you can bring in damage to take them out without suffering too many casualties. And finally, we're going to go with 10 Glade Guard. Of course, these will be the damage powerhouse of this stage of the game. With this many of them, you can focus fire pretty much anything and take it out in seconds. The range is great, the damage is fine, and the arc means you can stand them pretty much anywhere, and they'll get shots off without too much trouble. Get them the best angle you can, focus fire threats first, and then rain death pretty much everywhere. Just keep them safe, and they can carry you easily. Next up, we have tier 2. The Ancient Treeman should have all his spells online by now. Other than that, you should be using him mostly the same. Just be a little bit more careful where you send him to make sure he doesn't get surrounded by high damage or focused by ranged. We're also going to pick up a Spell Singer of Shadows, another caster of course with one of the best laws in the game for even more value and damage. Not great at much else but casting to keep him on the back to encourage troops and provide support. For the front lines, we're going with 6 Azrai Spear War Dancers, lateral move on the front lines with more damage but less toughness, so you're going to need to be on top of micro to win battles fast to avoid too many turns replenishing after every single battle. For the range, we're going to go with 6 Swift Shiver Shard Deepwood Scouts. The low range is a great trade-off for more magical damage, so I'm going to go for these guys. As long as enemies don't have super fast units, you find skirmish right out the gate before moving back once lines connect and firing from the backs and sides of the lines. Of course, keep them safe from melee as best you can and focus fire on key tags to take them out before they can get too much value. We're going to go with 4 Treekin that are going to back up the War Dancers and keep them alive by eating some of that incoming damage with their tankiness. Get into combat the moment the War Dancers connect for maximum value. The damage won't be crazy, but that's not their job, so don't worry about it too much. And finally, going to go with 2 Hawk Riders. A bit more range support with decent damage that they can fire from anywhere on the map. They're also going to act as backlines flankers since they do well versus most weaker troops, so use them to take those out before getting back into the sky to rain fire into the backs of enemy front lines. And finally, we have tier 3, still got the Ancient Tree Man, just be very careful where you send him now because the damage is so high that he can go down in seconds. The Spellslinger of Shadow should now have all their spells and be on a mount to zip around the battlefield, getting spell support wherever needed. Similar to the Hawk Riders, they can take out ranged if they absolutely need to, but aside from this, keep them central to your army to encourage and provide spells. We're going to go with 6 Blade Singers for the front lines, another lateral upgrade as they have even less armor but more defense and a ton more damage, either armor piercing or base. Be sure to switch stances for whatever they're fighting, and of course give them as much support as you can to keep them healthy. They'll do great damage, but giving them even more support will mean less casualties and less time spent replenishing. For the ranged, we're going to go with 6 Way Watchers, the final form of the Wood Elves ranged infantry. Use them pretty much the same as the Deepwood Scouts to skirmish if safe to do so at the start of a battle before moving them back to the backs and sides once the lines connect. Of course, keep them safe from melee as much as possible and focus fire on any high value targets or threats to them to keep themselves and your army as safe as possible. We're going to go with 4 Zotes to replace the Shrieking and bring even more damage to the front lines alongside their spell support to keep units healthy as much as they can. Do not forget about the bound spells, it's really easy to, and use them as often as you can for literally free value and healing. Other than that, just keep them battling in the front lines against high value targets with their respectable damage. And closing us out, we've got 2 Forest Dragons, possibly a bit excessive to have 2 of them, since mostly I want to use them to take out back lines, but they'll easily do that job and be able to take on front lines with massive damage. Again, don't forget about the breath ability and use it on cooldown for massive free damage. Honestly, just send them against pretty much anything and they'll do great. And that is everything you need to know on how to play the Wood Elves in battle and the final Immortal Empires faction guide for now. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know how to play the rest of the factions in Immortal Empires, then click on this playlist for every other faction guide.